In 1936, Joseph Kennedy sat down with his lawyers and created something designed to outlast him. A trust fund, then another after that, each one larger. By the time he died in 1969, those trusts held an estimated $400 million. Adjusted for today, somewhere north of $3 billion. He structured them carefully. Each of his children received roughly $10 million in principal. Control transferred at age 40, then again at 45. The money sat in Manhattan real estate, oil leases, and a building in Chicago called the Merchandise Mart, the largest commercial structure in the world at the time. Kennedy money did not earn interest in bank accounts. It collected rent from concrete and steel. The idea was simple. His children would never worry about earning a living. They could dedicate themselves entirely to politics and public service, to becoming the American dynasty he had willed into existence. And for a while, that is exactly what happened. A president, 2 senators, a family compound that doubled as a second White House. But Joseph Kennedy had 11 grandchildren, just from his son Bobby alone. Those 11 children grew up with trust fund payments, arriving on schedule, and footage of their father dying on a kitchen floor in Los Angeles, playing on loop in the national memory. Their mother was overwhelmed. 11 kids. No husband. And a last name that opened every door in America except the one they actually needed, which was a way out. I have spent a long time going through what happened to these children. The ones born into Kennedy wealth after the assassinations, after Chappaquiddick, after the cameras left and the compound went quiet. What I found is a story about money that covered tuition and lawyers and rehab stays at the finest facilities in the country. None of it was enough. Between 1973 and 2025, this next generation lost brothers to overdoses, cousins to plane crashes, siblings to ski accidents, and children to the open water. Some of them died at the very properties their grandfather had purchased to showcase Kennedy's success. One died in a hotel room a few blocks from the family estate that had just thrown him out. This is not the story of the Kennedys you already know. The assassinations, the presidency, the Camelot mythology. All of that has been told. This is what came after, the children who got the money and everything else. Chapter 1. The Night the Children Broke. Bobby Kennedy spent the afternoon of June 4, 1968, at the beach in Malibu with his 12-year-old son David. The California primary was that evening. Months of campaigning came down to this vote. Bobby should have been at headquarters, reviewing numbers, talking to staff. Instead, he was in the ocean with his kid. Maybe he needed one ordinary afternoon before whatever came next. They were in the water together when a strong undertow grabbed David and started pulling him out toward open sea. Bobby swam after him, reached him, pulled him back to shore. Father saved son from drowning. A small private moment that never made the papers because of what happened 12 hours later. That night, Bobby stood at a podium in the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles and delivered his victory speech. He had won California. The nomination was within reach. David was upstairs in a hotel room. His brothers and sisters were asleep. He was 12 and still buzzing from the day, so he stayed up and watched the coverage on television. He saw his father leave the podium. The cameras followed Bobby through the hotel kitchen. Then the shots. David watched his father get killed on live television, alone, in a hotel room, 12 years old. In the chaos downstairs, the ambulances and the screaming, nobody thought to check on a child in an upstairs room. Astronaut John Glenn and author Theodore White eventually found him. Hours later. He was still in front of the screen. He could not speak. I keep returning to the detail about that afternoon, Bobby pulling David from the Pacific, keeping him alive. And then everything after, pulling David under for the rest of his life. That time, nobody could reach him. Ethel Kennedy was 3 months pregnant with her 11th child when her husband was shot. She was at his side in the kitchen. She rode in the ambulance. She sat through the 26-hour vigil at Good Samaritan Hospital, while Bobby never regained consciousness. She came home to Hickory Hill in McLean, Virginia, with 10 children and one on the way. The youngest, Rory, would be born that December into a household that had already started to come undone. Hickory Hill was a 13-bedroom estate in Virginia where a sea lion once lived in the swimming pool, dogs running through every room, children climbing the furniture, the trees, each other. Bobby had liked it that way. He had grown up under his father's rigid discipline at the Hyannisport compound and deliberately chose something looser for his own family. Less structure, more warmth. Without Bobby, the looseness held nothing together. Ethel tried. A Gallup poll in 1969 named her the most admired woman in America, but admiration does not raise 11 children. According to biographer J. Randy Taraborelli, she burned through nannies at a pace that left the household in constant instability. When the older boys pushed back, and they always pushed back, she responded unpredictably. Sometimes withdrawal, sometimes rage, threats to disown them, to cut off trust fund access. The children learned that the rules shifted depending on what kind of day their mother was having. Time magazine drew a contrast that year between the two Kennedy widows. Jackie, they wrote, had moved into another world entirely. Ethel was simply trying to hold the original one together. The magazine framed this as a compliment. From the inside, it looked different. Bobby Jr. started using heroin at 15, David at 13. Both traced it back to the assassination and everything that followed. Years later, during Robert Kennedy Jr.'s confirmation hearings for Health and Human Services Secretary in 2025, their cousin Carolyn Kennedy said publicly that Bobby's basement, his garage, and his dorm room were where drugs were always available, that he had led other family members down the same road. Joe, the eldest son, was 16 when his father died. He took the Kennedy competitive streak and aimed it at speed, risk, anything physical. In the summer of 1973 on Nantucket, he was driving a Jeep with passengers including David and an 18-year-old local girl named Pam Kelly. The Jeep flipped on a sandy cutoff. Kelly was thrown out and landed on her spine. She was paralyzed from the chest down and spent the rest of her life in a wheelchair. Joe was fined $100. His license was temporarily suspended. He went on to serve 6 terms in Congress. Pam Kelly spent 47 years navigating a world built for people who can walk, then died in 2020 at 65. The accident also fractured David's vertebra. Doctors prescribed painkillers. For a boy already shattered by what he saw on that television screen in Los Angeles 5 years earlier, the pills opened a door that would never close. 11 children from Hickory Hill scattered into the 1970s. Each of them carried a trust fund, a famous name, and damage that operated on its own schedule. Some would survive it. Some would build real careers, real families, real distance from the worst of it. David could not get distance. He was the one who had been watching. Chapter 2. David. By his early 20s, David Kennedy had been to rehab more times than he had been to class at Harvard. He enrolled in 1974. Dropped out 2 years later. Went back. Dropped out again. A few months of effort, then heroin. Cocaine when heroin was not available. Whatever a Kennedy credit card and a famous last name could get at short notice, which in 1970s Boston and New York was essentially anything. One night in 1979, David drove his BMW to Harlem to buy drugs. He was mugged in the lobby of a rundown hotel. Beaten badly enough to end up at Massachusetts General Hospital, where doctors discovered something worse than the bruises: bacterial endocarditis, an infection in the lining of his heart caused by dirty needles. He was 24. The family paid for treatment. They always paid for treatment. David would fall, and Kennedy money would catch him with checks written to facilities that promised recovery and rarely delivered it. He cycled through programs in Boston, New York, Sacramento, Minneapolis. After each one, people around him would say David seemed better. Then the phone would ring with bad news from a different area code. There is a particular cruelty to being the broken one inside a family that does not tolerate broken people. Bobby Jr. had his own heroin years. Joe had the recklessness. But they found ways to keep functioning, to stay useful enough that the family looked past the damage. David could not do that. He was too honest about how wrecked he was. Or too wrecked to fake it. Maybe those are the same thing. A UPI reporter who interviewed him in Sacramento in 1982 found a young man working construction, taking classes, talking about wanting to go back to Harvard and become a writer. He described himself as a regular guy, 26, living in a small apartment with a girlfriend, skiing on weekends. For a brief window, it looked like Sacramento might be far enough from the Kennedy orbit to let him breathe. It was not. He came back east, April 1984. David had just finished another treatment program in Minneapolis. The family was gathering at the Palm Beach estate on North Ocean Boulevard for Easter. 93-year-old Rose Kennedy presiding. David checked into the Brazilian Court Hotel on April 19th with his younger brother Douglas and Douglas's school roommate. $150 a night. It was the first time any Kennedy had registered at that hotel instead of staying at the mansion. The staff assumed the house was simply full. He went to the estate on Tuesday, stayed half an hour. He was intoxicated, acting erratically, and was told to leave. Back at the Brazilian court, he drifted. A woman who spent time with him in those final days described him as sobbing and severely depressed, drinking vodka, snorting cocaine. On Easter Sunday, a priest celebrated Mass at the Kennedy Mansion. David was not there. Nobody at any of the 8 Catholic churches nearby saw him either. That evening, he approached Robert Driscoll, an artist selling paintings in the hotel's patio bar. David had a young woman with him. "Paint me a flower," he said. Driscoll painted him a red sea anemone and handed it over for free. He knew who David was. "Here is a kid who deserves something," Driscoll told a reporter later. The woman asked for the painting. Driscoll told David not to give it to her. I find that exchange hard to shake. A 28-year-old Kennedy heir asking a stranger in a hotel bar for a free painting of a flower. What happened between Tuesday evening and Wednesday morning is documented in roughly 500 pages of police files released after a legal fight. David was buying cocaine from a hotel bellhop named David Dorr. He had used heroin, cocaine, and various pills on 3 consecutive days. He was not hiding it. He was barely functional. Wednesday morning. Ethel called the hotel. David had not shown up for his flight to Boston. Hotel secretary Elizabeth Barnett went to room 107 and knocked. No answer. She used her passkey. Both beds were made. David was on the floor between them. She knelt down and touched his cheek. Cold. The staff kept saying the same thing afterward, that he looked like a little boy. He was 28 years old and had been using up his life since he was 12. When the hotel called Ethel back, she already knew. "He is dead, is he not?" she said, and hung up. The medical examiner found cocaine, the painkiller Demerol, and the tranquilizer Mellaril. 2 bellhops were arrested for supplying drugs, took plea deals for lesser charges, and received probation. Nobody else faced consequences. David was buried in Holyhood Cemetery in Brookline, Massachusetts, the 4th of Bobby and Ethel's 11 children. The first one they lost. He would not be the last. Chapter 3. The Estate That Wouldn't Stop. On the night of Good Friday, March 29, 1991, Senator Ted Kennedy could not sleep. He was at the family estate in Palm Beach, the same property on North Ocean Boulevard where David had been turned away 7 years earlier. Ted was 60, a sitting United States senator, and he had been drinking heavily that evening. Around midnight, he went upstairs and woke his son Patrick and his nephew William Kennedy Smith. He wanted to go out. They ended up at Al Bar, a nightclub on Royal Poinciana Way. Smith, a 30-year-old Georgetown medical student, met a 29-year-old woman named Patricia Bowman. Bowman and a friend went back to the Kennedy estate with Smith. What happened next became one of the most publicly dissected nights in American legal history. Bowman said Smith tackled her on the lawn near the beach and raped her while she told him to stop. She said he called her a name when she protested. Afterward, she said, Smith told her nobody would believe she had been raped at the Kennedy home. She took a notepad and a family urn from the house on her way out. Smith said the sex was consensual, Bowman's friend picked her up from the estate and drove her to the Palm Beach police station. She was taken to Humana Hospital. She had bruises on her midsection. She passed 2 polygraph tests. Smith was charged with second-degree sexual battery. An estimated 500 reporters descended on Palm Beach between April and December. The trial, starting December 2nd, was broadcast live. One of the first rape cases most Americans ever watched in real time. Bowman's face was hidden behind a blue electronic dot. Her name was withheld. That image became the trial's visual signature. Millions of people watched a woman describe the worst night of her life from behind a digital blur, while the man she accused sat fully visible a few feet away, carrying one of the most recognized last names in the country. Ted Kennedy took the stand. For 40 minutes he spoke about the family and about loss. Nothing he said was relevant to the prosecution's case. That was probably the point. The defense leaned on forensics. A professor testified that sand in Bowman's underwear matched the beach, which supported Smith's account. Under cross-examination, that collapsed. The prosecutor noted that a 200-pound man running across a beach would transfer sand to anyone nearby. The professor conceded the lawn also contained sand. Smith testified for 29 minutes. Calm, direct. The jury deliberated for 77 minutes and returned not guilty. 3 other women had come forward during the investigation saying Smith had assaulted them in separate incidents spanning 8 years. None had pressed charges at the time. Each said she did not believe she would be taken seriously because of his family. The judge did not allow their testimony at trial. What stays with me about this chapter of the Palm Beach estate is not the verdict. It is how that same strip of beachfront kept producing crisis after crisis while the family treated it as neutral ground. A place to gather for holidays, to recover from funerals, to go drinking on Good Friday with your nephew and end up on CNN for 6 months. Bowman identified herself publicly after the trial. Smith became a doctor, founded a landmine organization, and largely disappeared from public life. The estate stayed in the family. It had more to witness. Chapter 4. The Last Day of the Year. Before Michael Kennedy died, he was already finished. In the spring of 1997, reports surfaced that he had been having an affair with the family's babysitter. The girl had been 14 when it allegedly began. Michael was in his mid-30s, married, father of 3. His wife Victoria, daughter of sportscaster Frank Gifford, had reportedly caught them together. Michael took 3 polygraph tests arranged by his attorneys and claimed the relationship did not become sexual until the girl was 16, the age of consent in Massachusetts. The Norfolk County District Attorney investigated but dropped the case when the young woman refused to cooperate. No charges were filed. Michael issued a public apology to her and her family. The damage was done anyway. His brother Joe had been planning a run for governor of Massachusetts. The scandal made that impossible. Joe withdrew. The 2 brothers were described in the press as poster boys for bad behavior. Michael separated from Victoria. He had already been treated for alcoholism 2 years earlier, checking into a Maryland rehab facility on January 23, 1995. The same day, his grandmother, Rose Kennedy, died. I'm not sure what to do with that timing except note it. By late 1997, Michael was trying to put things back together. He had been out of public view for months. He ran Citizens Energy Corporation, his brother Joe's nonprofit that supplied discounted heating oil to low-income families. He co-founded Stop Handgun Violence. Reports suggested he and Victoria were reconciling. The family went to Aspen for the holidays. They had been going there since the early 1960s, when Bobby was still alive. Skiing during the day, dinner in the evening, and football. The Kennedys played football on ski slopes. Not casually. They would wait for the runs to clear at the end of the day, split into teams, and throw a ball back and forth while skiing downhill. Aspen Ski Patrol had warned them about this multiple times. The evening before New Year's Eve, officials from the Aspen Skiing Company called Ethel Kennedy directly and asked her to tell her children to stop. They played anyway. New Year's Eve, 1997. The family ate dinner at the Sundeck restaurant on Aspen Mountain and waited for the slopes to empty. late afternoon. The snow was slick and fast in the fading light. Michael brought a handheld camera and recorded himself skiing down the run, captaining one of the teams. After the first goal, he handed the camera to a friend. What happened next took seconds. Michael went out for a pass. He turned to catch it, eyes off the slope. He hit a tree head first. Family members reached him quickly. He was unresponsive. Ski patrol arrived within 4 minutes and began cardiac care on the mountainside. They brought him down on a toboggan as darkness fell. On the way down, his pulse stopped. At Aspen Valley Hospital, doctors could do nothing more. Michael Kennedy was pronounced dead at 5:50 in the afternoon. He was 39. The body was flown to Massachusetts the next day. On New Year's morning, the family gathered at Hyannis Port. The flag at the compound flew at half-staff. Ethel had now buried 2 of her 11 children, David in 84, Michael in 97. The ski patrol had tried to prevent it. The resort had called the family the night before, and the Kennedys played football on a mountain in fading light anyway, because risk was something that happened to other people. Michael Kennedy is buried at Holyhood Cemetery in Brookline, same cemetery as David. Chapter 5. America's Prince. There is a photograph that defined a life before it was lived. November 25, 1963. A 3-year-old boy in a blue coat saluting his father's coffin outside St. Matthew's Cathedral. John Kennedy Jr. had no memory of that moment. He said so later. The image belonged to everyone else, and it followed him for 35 years. He became a lawyer, then left law to build something of his own. In 1995, he launched George, a political magazine that treated Washington like Hollywood. It worked for a while. By 1999, the magazine was losing close to $10 million a year, and his publisher was preparing to kill it. People magazine had named him the sexiest man alive at 27. He had dated actresses and models. None of that was going to save a failing business. His marriage was in worse shape than the magazine. John married Carolyn Bessette in September 1996. Secret ceremony on Cumberland Island, Georgia. The privacy lasted about a day. Paparazzi took permanent positions outside their Tribeca apartment. Every outfit Carolyn wore was photographed, every expression analyzed. She told a friend the only way to avoid the cameras was to leave at 7 in the morning. Then Princess Diana was killed in a paparazzi chase in Paris, August 1997. John's assistant Rosemarie Terenzio said Carolyn was horrified, not just by the death, but by the logic of it. If it could happen to Diana, it could happen to them. Carolyn told friends she was afraid the photographers would come for her and John even harder now, because they no longer had Diana to follow. She stopped going out. She refused to have children because she could not imagine raising them under surveillance. John wanted children. They went to counseling. By the summer of '99, they were reportedly living apart. John spent at least one night that final week at the Stanhope Hotel instead of their apartment. His closest friend, cousin Anthony Radziwill, was dying of cancer. George was collapsing. A recently broken ankle was still in a brace. Into all of this, Carolyn's sister Lauren offered to join them on the flight to Rory Kennedy's wedding in Hyannis Port. Lauren would be dropped at Martha's Vineyard. Then John and Carolyn would continue to the compound together. Lauren came along to ease the tension between them. That decision cost her life. Friday evening, July 16, 1999. John took off from Essex County Airport in New Jersey in his Piper Saratoga. He had owned the plane less than 3 months. He held a private pilot's license but was not instrument-rated, meaning he could navigate by sight but was not trained to fly using instruments alone in low visibility. The forecast at departure looked acceptable. By the time they were airborne, haze had settled over the water. Other pilots on similar routes that night, all of them instrument-qualified, reported no visible horizon. Somewhere over open ocean between Rhode Island Sound and Martha's Vineyard, John lost spatial orientation. Without visual references and without the training to trust his instruments, he could not tell which way was up. The plane entered a graveyard spiral, a tightening, descending turn that accelerates as the pilot overcorrects. rate of descent exceeding 1,400 meters per minute. The Piper Saratoga hit the Atlantic at 9:41 in the evening, roughly 12 kilometers southwest of Martha's Vineyard. John was 38, Carolyn was 33, Lauren was 34. The search lasted 5 days. Debris and a suitcase belonging to Lauren washed ashore on Saturday. On Wednesday, Navy divers found the wreckage 37 meters below the surface. All three were still strapped into their seats. They had died on impact. The ashes were scattered at sea from a Navy destroyer. Rory Kennedy's wedding was postponed. Anthony Radziwill died of cancer 3.5 weeks later. Chapter 6. The Compound Keeps Counting. After JFK Jr.'s plane went into the Atlantic, there was a lull. Not peace. Just a stretch of years where nobody died in a way that made national news. The family kept producing lawyers and nonprofit directors and the occasional congressman. People stopped talking about the curse for a while. It did not stop. In May 2012, Mary Richardson Kennedy was found dead in a barn on the property she shared with Robert Kennedy Jr. in Bedford, New York. She was 52. The medical examiner ruled it a suicide by hanging. The autopsy found antidepressants in her blood and no alcohol. Mary and Bobby Jr. had married in 1994. 4 children. By 2010, he had filed for divorce. What followed was bitter and public. Custody fights, police calls to the house. Mary was arrested twice for impaired driving. Bobby had kept a diary in 2001 that documented sexual encounters with 37 different women during their marriage. Mary found it and passed it to her sisters with instructions that it should be published if anything happened to her. When Bobby arrived at the property after her death, Mary's sister said to him, "You have killed my sister." The family handled the funeral. The family handled the burial. Bobby won a court battle over her remains and buried her at a Kennedy cemetery on Cape Cod, near his Aunt Eunice. Her own family had wanted her elsewhere. Even in death, the Kennedys controlled the narrative. 7 years later, the compound itself became the scene again. August 1st, 2019. Saoirse Kennedy Hill, 22 years old, granddaughter of Bobby and Ethel, was found unresponsive in a bedroom at the Hyannisport compound. She had spent the previous evening with her grandmother, dinner together, watched the Democratic debates on television, went out with friends afterward, sang karaoke at a local bar. The next afternoon she was dead. Toxicology found methadone, diazepam, fluoxetine, and alcohol. Saoirse had written openly about her depression in her high school newspaper at Deerfield Academy. She described it as a heavy boulder on her chest that would be with her for the rest of her life. She was right about that, though not in the way she meant. 8 months later, during COVID lockdown in April 2020, Maeve Kennedy McKean took her 8-year-old son Gideon out in a canoe from her mother's waterfront property in Maryland. They were chasing a kickball that had blown into the Chesapeake Bay. The wind was stronger than it looked. Their canoe drifted past the sheltered cove into open water. Maeve was essentially paddling alone. An 8-year-old is not much help against the Chesapeake in April. A bystander saw them struggling and called for help. By the time rescue boats launched, the canoe had capsized. The water was 51 degrees. Neither was wearing a life vest. Maeve's body was recovered 4 days later. Gideon's 2 days after that. She was 40. He was 8. She had been a Georgetown professor, a human rights attorney, an advisor in the Obama administration. She had publicly criticized her Uncle Bobby Jr. for spreading misinformation about vaccines. None of that mattered against wind and cold water and a kickball drifting away from shore. Ethel Kennedy, the woman who had held what was left of this family together since 1968, suffered a stroke in her sleep on October 3, 2024. She died a week later, 96 years old. 3 presidents spoke at her memorial. Her son Bobby Jr. had endorsed Donald Trump 6 weeks before she died. Several of her other children had publicly denounced him for it. The family that had always closed ranks was now split in a way that Rose and Joe Sr. could never have imagined. The most recent loss came 2 months after Ethel. On December 30th, 2025, Tatiana Schlossberg died of acute myeloid leukemia. She was 35, daughter of Caroline Kennedy, granddaughter of JFK Yale graduate, New York Times climate reporter, author. She had published an essay in The New Yorker 5 weeks before her death, on November 22nd, the 62nd anniversary of her grandfather's assassination. In it, she wrote about her terminal diagnosis, about her 2 small children, about watching her family try to hide their grief from her. She also wrote about her cousin Bobby Jr. cutting funding for mRNA vaccine research that could help cancer patients like her. Her final words in that essay were not about politics. They were about her mother. "For my whole life," she wrote, "I have tried to be good. To be a good student and a good sister and a good daughter. Now I have added a new tragedy to her life, to our family's life, and there is nothing I can do to stop it." Caroline Kennedy was 5 when her father was assassinated, 10 when her uncle Bobby was shot, 38 when her brother John's plane went into the ocean, and 68 when her daughter told her, in print, that the pattern had found them again. The compound at Hyannisport still stands. The trust funds still pay out. The name still opens doors. Joseph Kennedy built all of it to last, and it has lasted. Just not the way he planned. Chapter 7. What the Money Built. Joseph Kennedy bought the Merchandise Mart in Chicago around 1945 for $12.5 million. When his heirs sold it in 1998, the price was $625 million. At the time, it was the family's last operating business. The Kennedys were out of commerce entirely. All that remained was the trust funds, the real estate, and the name. The Palm Beach estate went 3 years earlier, sold in 1995 for just under $5 million, a few months after Rose Kennedy died at 104. A historian close to the family wrote that Palm Beach was not a place where the youngest generation of Kennedys found sustenance. By then, the property had hosted a patriarch's stroke, a grandson's last Easter, and a nationally televised rape trial. The buyer spent millions restoring it. The house has changed hands twice since. In 2020, it sold for $70 million. Strangers live there now. Hickory Hill, the Virginia estate where Bobby and Ethel raised 11 children, was sold by Ethel in 2009 for $8.25 million. She moved to Hyannisport full-time. That leaves the compound, the original property Joe purchased in 1928. 6 acres on the waterfront. 3 houses. Ted Kennedy's widow, Vicky, occupies 1. Extended family uses the others. The trust funds Joe created have now been paying out for nearly a century. Forbes estimated the top 30 family members are worth a combined $1.2 billion. Caroline Kennedy, JFK's only surviving child, holds the largest share at an estimated $250 million. Bobby Jr., one of 11 siblings splitting a single branch of the fortune, is worth somewhere between $15 and $30 million depending on the source. Enough to live comfortably. Not Kennedy dynasty money by any historical standard. Joe Sr. wanted his money to free his descendants from the distraction of earning a living so they could serve the public. By that measure, the experiment half worked. The family produced a president, 3 senators, a handful of congressmen, ambassadors, and 1 current cabinet secretary. It also produced overdoses, drownings, a paralyzed 18-year-old left in a wheelchair for 47 years, and a line of funerals stretching from 1944 to 2025. I do not think Joe Kennedy imagined any of this. Not the trust funds paying for rehab centers. Not the compound where a granddaughter would die in her sleep. Not the estate in Palm Beach being sold to strangers because the family could no longer stand being there. He designed a machine for producing greatness. It produced some. It also consumed the people inside it at a rate he might have recognized from business, even if he would never have wanted to. The 6 acres at Hyannisport are quiet now. The lawn is there, the dock is there. The water does what it has always done. If you walked the property without knowing its history, you would see a nice family compound on Cape Cod. That is what Joseph Kennedy paid for in 1928. everything else he got for free. The people who study the Kennedy family tend to reach for the word curse. It is a convenient word. It suggests something supernatural, something beyond anyone's control. A force that chose this family and would not let go. I am not sure I believe in curses. What I see when I look at this story is something less mysterious and more difficult to accept. A family that built incredible wealth and used it to pursue power at a scale most Americans can only observe from a distance. And a set of consequences that arrived not because of fate, but because of what that pursuit did to the people caught inside it. David Kennedy did not die because of a curse. He died because he was 12 years old and alone in a hotel room, watching his father bleed out on live television, and nobody came for him for hours, and the family that should have held him together after that night did not know how. The children who came after David faced variations of the same problem. Money everywhere, attention everywhere, and a gap where ordinary life should have been that no trust fund, no last name, and no compound on Cape Cod could fill. Joseph Kennedy wanted a dynasty. He got one. It is still going. His great-grandchildren carry the name into rooms that open for them the way rooms opened for his children 80 years ago. Whether that is a blessing or something else depends on which Kennedy you ask, and how many of them are left to answer.